Hello and welcome to our little discussion of the somatosensory system. Now the somatosensory system is, like its name would suggest, the ability of the nervous system to bring signals from the periphery into the central nervous system. And to kind of get a handle on that, we're going to draw a little bit of a idealized / schematic of the central nervous system. It's going to show all the players involved and what we need to understand in order to understand this system. So it's a little tough to make out right here, but what we're looking at is the brain, brainstem, and spinal cord. So right here we've got the cortex. Right around here, this bulge, a little bit extravagant, is the pons. And this little area right here is the medulla. And then everything thereafter is the spinal cord. The spinal cord is what's bringing information from the periphery to the central nervous system. Now what we're going to talk about first is the first part of the somatosensory system. It's broken into two parts. And the first one is referred to as the DCML, which breaks down to the dorsal column, medial lemniscal system. And what you need to know about it in particular is that it is the pathway that carries fine touch sensation, proprioception, and vibration. So even though it seems a little odd, our central nervous system actually breaks up sensation this way. So one system carries fine touch, proprioception, and vibration. That's the DCML, and another system carries pain and temperature, and we'll see it in just a little bit. Now next, what we need to get to is, how do these nerves actually get into the spinal cord? Well, the place that they start is by going in from the peripheral nerves at their bodies in the posterior root ganglia, and at each level you've got nerves entering the spinal cord, and then those signals are going to move up superiorly to get to the cortex where sensation is interpreted. Now to get a handle on that, what we're going to do is kind of choose two arbitrary levels. We're going to pick, let's say, L5, fifth lumbar segment, and T1, first thoracic segment of the spinal cord. And mostly because these guys correspond to signals that are going to the lower limb and upper limb respectively. So let's start with L5 right here, and we'll draw out the spinal cord. You have to bear with me for just a little bit here, as my fine artistic skills leave a bit to be desired. So we've got the spinal cord in cross section. Next we draw in the little butterfly of gray matter, or neuron cell bodies, that's located within. We'll shade that in just a hair. And from the spinal cord you've got a dorsal or posterior root and a ventral or anterior root. And you notice here the posterior root has a bulge in it. That's referred to as the posterior or dorsal root ganglion, and that'll be important in a moment. And then these two come together at the spinal nerve and then split into an anterior and posterior ramus. Now, as we discussed before, sensation has to get from the periphery, so out here somewhere at the skin. We sense vibration, proprioception, or fine touch, and a peripheral nerve carries that impulse back to the spinal cord. Now it could be coming from either the dorsal, posterior, or the ventral, anterior root, but either way, those axons cluster together in the spinal nerve, and all sensory input goes to the dorsal root ganglion or posterior root ganglion right there. And then it heads into the spinal cord. Now at this point it's important to know that the first cell body in this chain is located here at the posterior root ganglion, aka dorsal root ganglion. So we've got those right there. Now at this point, these axons carry in vibration, proprioception, and fine touch, travel on the dorsal aspect of the spinal cord to a little area chock full of white matter. And this is referred to as the dorsal columns, hence dorsal column portion of the name. Now, once these guys join this column, they shoot superiorly, sending their axons up along this path. And at this point, if it's coming from the lower limb or anywhere below about T5, it's referred to as the Fasciculus gracilis. If you think about something graceful, that kind of implies that they use their legs and feet well, so something that is graceful is using the gracilis, and that's where it's giving it an update about the lower body. Now we're going to jump up considerably to T1. In the in-between, as well as all the areas above and below, we have the same process going, but at T1, got a slightly larger spinal cord because there's more white matter hanging out in there. All the same material. Posterior root ganglion, posterior root, anterior root, spinal nerve, posterior ramus, anterior ramus, etc., etc. And we've still got gray matter hanging out in the center, ventral horn and dorsal horn, the spinal cord, and a little central canal we'll draw it into. Now, one thing I want you to know is this Fasciculus gracilis continues all the way up and passes through this same area, and it actually kind of becomes segregated a little bit on the medial side. So the Fasciculus gracilis just contains a lot of axons from the lower limb, etc., that are traveling up through this area. But around this area, T1, we've got a second one that's packed on lateral to it. That's called the Fasciculus cuneatus. And what's it doing? It's doing the exact same thing the other one was doing. It's carrying vibration, proprioception, and fine touch from the periphery, hence the arrowhead, to the spinal nerve, posterior root. There's the cell body once again. First cell body's in the dorsal root ganglia. Here, anything above about roughly T5, and especially the upper limb, is going to ascend in the fasciculus cuneatus. Really about the same thing. So what I want you to get is Fasciculus gracilis we're going to associate primarily with the lower limb, Fasciculus cuneatus primarily with the upper limb. And the two of these together, and we'll kind of shadow them in on the other side, are the dorsal columns. All right. So here, we're going to follow that a little bit more in from this side. So we've got these axons entering and ascending if they're from the lower limb in the Fasciculus gracilis. And if they're coming from the upper limb or anywhere above T5, they're ascending similarly in the Fasciculus cuneatus. And when they reach the lower part of the medulla, they are going to synapse. And we're going to put those cell bodies that they synapse with, color them right in here in green. And we've got the same thing happening over on this side of the diagram. And the nice thing is, the Fasciculus gracilis synapses with the nucleus gracilis. Can't get any better than that. And surprise, surprise, the Fasciculus cuneatus synapses with the nucleus cuneatus. Alright, so take a good look at that, because what happens next is a little odd. These second cell bodies, and by the way, that's where the second cell body is for both of those systems, then cross the midline, and in neuroscience it's referred to as decusating. So they cross the midline and then ascend. So this crossing occurs in a relatively narrow band of the medulla, and that's referred to as the internal arcuate fasciculus. And if you haven't figured out already, fasciculus just means big cluster of axons that's moving up and down. Now once the internal arcuate fasciculus has been seen, and these guys are well on their way to ascending, They form a very dense bundle of axons that's now referred to as the medial lemniscus. Hence, the second half of the name of the whole system. Now these do something very nice for us, which is they head up to the thalamus, and there they synapse with specific nuclei located in one thalamic nucleus. And that is the ventral, posterior, lateral, thalamic nucleus. And so that we all don't go nuts, we're just going to refer to that from here on out as the VPL. And that is the location of the third cell bodies in the chain. And it's a 3-neuron chain to get information from the periphery up to the central nervous system. The brain, I should say, rather, than the cortex. So right here, we're going to color that in on our little longitudinal schematic here. Synapses in the VPL. And at this point, these ascend in what's called the internal capsule, and they go to the specific region of the cortex where they are meant to go by the somatotopic mapping. And if you remember the homunculus, the picture of the little guy with his knee dangling over here, his feet hanging down, torso, arms, head, tongue, etc., laid out across here, if the fasciculus gracilis is coming all the way from the legs, it is going to send information to the section that's involved with the lower limb. Likewise, fasciculus cuneatus going to the trunk as well as the upper limb, and that's the section of the cortex that those guys are going to head off to. Now the name of that area of the cortex does have a specific name, and we're going to refer to it properly. It's the post-central gyrus. It's the most anterior portion of the parietal lobe, and that is a part of the cerebral cortex. So, long story short, what do we want to get out of this? Dorsal column medial lemniscal system has cell bodies located in 3 places. The first cell body is located in the posterior root ganglia, aka dorsal root ganglia. The second cell body is located in either the nucleus cuneatus for the upper limb and above T5, the nucleus gracilis for the lower limb. So those are both in the medulla. Nucleus cuneatus, nucleus gracilis. And after they've synapsed there, they head up, and what's important is that the internal arcuate fasciculus, they decussate, they cross over to the opposite side of the central nervous system. And after they decussate, they reach the third cell body in the chain, and they're all located in the ventral, posterior, lateral nucleus of the thalamus. Alright, we'll follow this up in a little bit with how the lesions of different areas of the spinal cord affect these systems, but first we're going to go to our other half of the somatosensory system, the anterolateral system. Alright, let's get started looking at the anterolateral system, second part of the somatosensory system. And as you can probably see, I've saved just a little bit of time by not inflicting my artistic abilities on you any further. We've drawn the spinal cord cross sections in, and the central nervous system here looks a little bit like Mom from Futurama, if anybody catches that reference. And we're going to talk now about the anterolateral system, so called because it hangs out on the anterior and lateral side of the spinal cord. And you also will hear this referred to as the spinothalamic tract. And we'll get into how and why it's called that and where the exceptions are in a little bit. But the most important thing about this to know is this is the area or the scheme that carries the pain and intense temperature sensation from the body. So painful or very notable temperature changes are going to be carried by this system. Now, once again, you've got input coming from all the levels of the body, each spinal level, from C1 down to S5. But we're going to take a look at just a couple representative ones, and we'll stick with L5 and T1 like we did last time, to kind of serve as an example of how these signals get into and travel within the central nervous system. So first things first, we've got painful or intense temperature sensation that's going to jump on a peripheral nerve from a free nerve ending out in the, or a lightly myelinated nerve ending out in the periphery, goes through the anterior posterior ramus spinal nerve, gets to the posterior root ganglion, and that's where the cell body is located. Every sensory cell body in the peripheral nervous system has its cell body located there. But as this guy gets into the spinal cord, it immediately heads to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, and at that point it's going to synapse with cell bodies located right there. So as per usual, we can see that the first cell body is in the posterior root ganglion, but in this case the second is located in what we're going to refer to as the lamina 1 and 2. Now, the lamina are just breakdowns of the various levels of the spinal cord, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on. This is a simplification, but it's a useful simplification. These cell bodies are hanging out in the dorsalmost area of the gray matter of the spinal cord, lamina 1 and 2, and once synapsing occurs, these guys send axons across the midline, so they decussate immediately right here at this little anterior commissure, and they head to the anterior and lateral side of the spinal cord, and right here they jump into a bundle and ascend. So they head superiorly to get to the cortex. Now this is the anterior lateral system hanging out in the anterior lateral section of white matter here, and if it's coming from the lower limb, say L5, it's going to jump on here and head up, and it's already inside this collection of ascending axons as another one comes in. So from here at the T1 level, we got the same thing: pain, temperature from the medial aspect of your arm is going to jump on the T1 branches of the spinal nerve, head back up, posterior root ganglion, where the cell bodies are located, come into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, synapse with the second cell bodies in lamina 1 and 2, sends the axon across the anterior commissure there, decussates, and jumps on a little more medially because the lower limb axons are already there filling up space. So this cluster right here is the anterolateral system. And the axons in it that go to the thalamus are the spinothalamic tract axons. So these guys do something very similar to what we've already seen before. They're going to ascend until they get all the way to the thalamus. And let's draw that in over here. We've got this sensation coming in, synapses right away, same thing's happening at T1 and all these other levels. And as soon as it synapses, these guys decussate and ascend in the anterolateral portion of the spinal cord. Same thing happening right about here. And they're going to ascend all the way through the medulla, the pons, most of the brainstem, until they get to the thalamus. And here's the good news. You have seen where these guys are going already. They are going to the VPL nucleus of the thalamus. So all somatosensory information, whether it's from the medial limnoscal system or the anterolateral system, winds up at the ventral posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus one way or the other. So let's draw that in here. So these guys come in. We're going to go a little higher up. They're going to head up, synapse with third order cell bodies in the VPL, and at that point they're going to head off to the appropriate area of cortex. So if it's axons that are coming from the lower limb, they're going to end up right around in here. If there are axons coming from the torso, right around in here. Sorry, lower limb, torso, arm, head, all laid out somatotopically across the post central gyrus of the parietal lobe. So, easy, right? It is. That's the spinal thalamic tract carrying pain and temperature. That's what makes you willfully aware of any pain or intense temperature that you feel. But pain is really, really complicated. And we're not even going to go into the more severe aspects of it. But in addition to the spinal thalamic tract, the anterolateral system has other parts that jump off and head to different areas of the spinal cord and brainstem. They're going to head to an area in the medulla and some of the metencephalon there that's referred to as the Reticular Formation. So they're going to head to Reticular Formation ganglia, and hence the guys that jump on there are referred to as spino-reticular tract axons. Some of them head up to the midbrain, in particular locus ceruleus and the periaqueductal gray matter around the midbrain. Those are referred to as spino-mesencephalic or sometimes spinotectal axons. And last but not least, just before it gets to the thalamus, some of these guys peel off and head to the region just under the thalamus, the hypothalamus. Messing up my color scheme a little, but we'll live with it. And no big surprise, spino-hypothalamic tract. So the anterolateral system encompasses the spino-thalamic, which is the one that you are going to care the most about in a medical neuroscience course, because that's where the conscious perception of pain takes place. So if you lose that tract, you lose the ability to consciously understand pain from that contralateral side of the body. But anterolateral system is spinothalamic, spino-reticular, spino-mesencephalic, spino-hypothalamic, and these guys are responsible for some of the other aspects of pain. Reticular formation in particular is involved with wakefulness. So if you are in a nice restful sleep and you get stung by a wasp, which I've been, you wake up pretty fast. That's your spinal reticular tract signaling to get you ready to deal with whatever it is that's causing you pain, like smashing a wasp with a big book. Midbrain is involved with pain modulation, and that's all we're going to say about that because it's very complex and will probably be the subject of a lecture all on its own. And hypothalamus is involved with modulating your emotional and autonomic responses to pain. And again, very complex, so we'll just leave that right there. What do we care the most about for a medical neuroscience course? It's that spinothalamic tract. And its first cell body, just like the other, is located in posterior root ganglion. Second cell body is the only real difference. It's located in lamina 1 and 2. And again, that's a massive simplification of the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. And at that point, it decussates pretty much immediately, anteriorly in the spinal cord, heads up in the anterolateral aspect of the cord until it reaches the VPL hypothalamus, where the third order cell bodies are located, synapses with those, and then heads up to the cortex to be interpreted, understood, and taken care of. That's pretty much it for the somatosensory system. We're going to come back in just a second and go through how lesions affect the different systems when they occur on the spinal cord. Alright, so let's do a quick review of the spinal cord and the major somatosensory ascending systems, taking information from the periphery up to the cortex. And we're going to throw in a little bit of the descending system, the lateral corticospinal tract, which is the main motor tract that we care about in medical neuroscience. So first things first, again, I'm not going to inflict my art on you here, so we've already drawn this out. So if we've got pain and temperature information, it's coming into the spinal nerve from free nerve endings out in the periphery, heads into the posterior root, cell body is located therein, comes across, gets to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. At that point, it's going to, I'll leave it the same color, red for pain and temperature. It's going to synapse with its second order cell body right there, and that guy's going to decussate, cross, head over to the anterolateral tract, and it's already got several axons from whatever level happens to be below here coming through there. This guy joins the crowd, ascends to reach the BPL thalamus. I'm going to take vibration, proprioception, and fine touch, and those axons coming from things like Pacinian corpuscles, Meissner's corpuscles, etc., are going to join from the peripheral nerve into the spinal nerve, through the posterior root, cell body, once again located in the DRG, posterior root ganglion, into the posterior root. And these guys are going to ascend in the dorsal columns, and we're going to work those in here. So here we've got a dorsal column collection of cells closer to the midline. This is the Fasciculus gracilis. The one that's a little lateral to it is the Fasciculus cuneatus. And if we're below T5, we don't have a Fasciculus cuneatus. We only get that after we've gone above about T5. So from the lower limb, jumps into Fasciculus gracilis alongside all the other axons that are coming from the levels below. It's above T5, particularly in the upper limbs. It jumps onto Fasciculus cuneatus and joins any axons that happen to be there already. Now, we haven't discussed this in detail, but most of you will probably have covered some of this in terms of looking at motor activity. Motor activity also decussates, but instead of going from the periphery up, it's coming from the cortex down. And the tract it travels in is located in the lateral white matter of the spinal cord. It's called the lateral corticospinal tract. Name pretty much tells you what it's going to do. And it's continuing through, all the way down throughout the spinal cord, and as it reaches the level where it's going to innervate lower motor neurons, it peels the axons off. They head into the anterior part of the gray matter of the spinal cord, anterior or ventral horn, synapse of the lower motor neuron, and that guy heads out the anterior root, spinal nerve, and then goes to muscle. Not a red Pacinian corpuscle, it's muscle. I swear. Right there. And if we draw these guys in, remember they're symmetrical. They're on both sides. There's the lateral corticospinal in green, dorsal column, medial lemniscal system in purple, Fasciculus gracilis, and the more laterally, Fasciculus cuneatus, and the anterolateral system hanging out at every level of the spinal cord right here, receiving axons from the contralateral side. So that's the quick summary of what's going on and how all these tracts are traveling. What we're going to do now is see what happens with certain spinal cord injuries and how it affects all of those guys. Alright, so take one last look at this label right here, and we're going to just ease it out of the way and throw in somebody who is unlabeled. And now we're going to see if we can figure out how different spinal cord injuries compromise the different systems that we've been studying. So first things first, if I very perversely decide to just start lesioning this person's central nervous system in various places to make a point, one place I might start is right here, spinal nerve. That'll be our first spot. A lesion right there is going to result in motor and sensory loss at that spinal level. Which makes sense because the motor nerves can't get out, the sensory nerves can't get in, and that's about it. Let's say I cause a lesion right here. What's going to happen then? Motor's coming out this way. It's unaffected. Sensory coming back in, however, is knocked out. So sensory and all sensory loss occurs when you have damage to any part of the posterior root right there. But if it's only that particular root, it's only going to be that level. The other spinal levels will be just fine if the damage is isolated to that one spot. And conversely, shouldn't be much of a surprise, if I have damage right there at the anterior root, that's going to knock out all motor activity at that particular level. And if you've covered upper versus lower motor neuron signs yet, this would be a lower motor neuron loss and would cause flaccid paralysis of any of the muscles innervated by that particular nerve. Alright, so that's fairly straightforward. Now let's get a little more sophisticated. We're going to go into the spinal cord, and let's just say we've lesioned one entire side of the dorsal column right here. We've, at one level, not the entire length of the spinal cord, but at one level, we've created a massive lesion right there. What's going to be lost? Well, motor's fine. It's coming down, synapsing, heading out. Anterolateral system coming in, synapses here, as long as the damage doesn't extend into the gray matter, it's also fine. But any info that's trying to make it up through the dorsal columns is now going to be lost. And that's going to result in vibration, proprioception, fine touch losses on the ipsilateral side. And that is important. Ipsilateral, because it's sensory and it hasn't decussated yet. So any lesion here affects your perception of information coming from that side. And what's even more important, potentially, than that, is it's not just wiping out the one level. If you've got damage here, you can't get these other axons that are trying to get upward past the blockage. Now, up above the lesion, they're going to be just fine. So you'll have an area where you've got vibration, proprioception, and fine touch losses on the ipsilateral side at all levels below the lesion. Now we're assuming that this has wiped out all of the dorsal column medial meniscal system on this particular side, but nothing else. That's a little bit of a simplification from reality, but it makes sense when you're trying to learn it. Let's move over to here, and let's wipe out the anterolateral system at the same level. That'll be the converse. We're going to have just fine vibration, proprioception, and fine touch, but we're going to have a loss of the pain and temperature sensation at that level. But here's the tricky thing. It's not on the same side. If it's coming in from here, it's synapsing and heading over this way. So we're actually losing, by damaging this side of the spinal cord, we're losing the contralateral input. So pain and temperature losses from the contra, or opposite, lateral side. And just as before, if we've got info below there, a level below this lesion, it hits that lesion and is probably not going to be able to get past it. So you've got it affecting all levels below the lesion. Now this system is a little bit tricky in that it ascends just a little bit as it comes in. It's not going to be 100% at the same level, but it's pretty close. Any info that joins the anterolateral system above the lesion is just fine. So you're going to be able to have a very real way of determining where the lesion in the spinal cord is by doing a good neurologic exam. Close to the end. Let's wipe out the lateral corticospinal tract. Motor is coming down. So we've wiped out the lateral corticospinal tract. That is going to result in motor loss. And you can be asking whether it's ipsi or contralateral. Well, it's ipsi, because these guys are going to head out here to the same side and then head out, upper motor neurons to lower motor neurons, and then out the spinal nerve. So damage here affects the same side. Now these guys decussated way up in the brainstem, so that's been long done. So it's going to have motor loss, and if it's wiped out this whole area, it's wiped out all the levels below the lesion. Alright, so that takes us through all of those guys individually. Now let's look at what's referred to as a fairly common spinal injury, largely because penetrating trauma that hits the spinal cord is often deflected by the spinous processes of the vertebra, and you can actually wind up with more frequency than you'd probably imagine penetrating trauma that affects one entire half of the spinal cord. So you've received damage to just the one side, and again, we're going to simplify it and assume that the damage affects everything on this side and absolutely nothing on the opposite side. Now, is that reality? No, but it's a nice simplification so that we can learn what the heck we're talking about. So that's going to be our 7th lesion here. And that is referred to as a Brown-Séquard syndrome. And it's going to seem a little overwhelming. But if we break it down, we wiped out the lateral corticospinal tract. So we've got loss of motor on the ipsilateral side, and that's going to cause upper motor neuron signs. So spastic activity of the levels below the lesion, fascicular, or kind of just rigidity, hyperreflexia is going to result from that, upper motor neuron signs. We've wiped out the dorsal column medial lemniscal system. So we've got sensory loss of vibration, proprioception, fine touch, and that is going to be, again, because it hasn't decussated yet, ipsilateral. We've wiped out anterolateral tract right here, but remember, it decussated from the opposite side before joining this tract. So we're going to have sensory loss of pain and temperature from the contralateral side. So that's not too hard. The tricky part about Brown-Séquard, sorry, let's move that up a little, is that not only have we lost the white matter tracts, but we've also lost the gray matter. So in addition to these guys, we're going to have, at the single level affected here, wiped out the anterior horn of the spinal cord. So we're going to have, at one level, at the affected, pardon me, getting a little crammed for space here, level, lower motor neuron signs, but only at that damaged level. We're going to have wiped out the dorsal horn of the spinal cord on that side. And so we're also going to have, ready for it, ipsilateral loss of the anterolateral system, but only at that level. It's fine below there and can send axons to the opposite side without trouble. So that is what gets a little tricky about Brown-Séquard syndrome, but if you know your spinal cord anatomy and you know your tracts, you can break it all down and figure it out, especially in the context of a question where they have to give you a list of symptoms that make some coherent sense. All right, I hope this has been helpful, and happy studying.